Link's Awakening is a weird game, and I mean super weird. You may have played this game before either on the Switch or Game Boy, and experienced some oddities such as all the Mario references in this game, or the fact that you can literally steal items from a shop owner and be electrocuted to death if you get caught. But it gets even stranger than that. I replayed Link's Awakening for this video, picked apart this game with a fine-tooth comb, and I'll be discussing my experience and opinions regarding this game throughout the video. Make sure to watch until the end because I'll be discussing some strange and interesting aspects about this game that I don't hear people talk about enough. I mean, this game literally has you making a raccoon sniff salts to snap out of tripping on shrooms, as well as making you an accomplice for a sociopathic goat who uses you to catfish a poor guy into thinking he's actually having relations with Princess Peach. That's just a sample of what this game has to offer. During my in-depth analysis of this game, I'll be covering the strengths and weaknesses dungeon by dungeon of what this game has to offer, as well as discussing how Link's Awakening holds up today. I'll be playing the Link's Awakening DX version released for the Game Boy Color in 1998 for this video, because I feel like it would be more interesting to start with the original release that started it all, but I don't want to play through the original release in 1993, because I doubt anyone would want to watch this for the next 50 or so minutes. The color in the DX version just makes things more watchable, and it's not like the DX colorized version changed all that much from the original, besides adding color to everything. Also, during my playthrough, I won't be using save states and won't be looking up anything online, because cheating's for chumps. Back in the day, before you could just buy your video games digitally, there were instruction booklets that the games came with that were pretty important for the players to look over to understand what the heck they were getting themselves into. And they were also just a cool thing to look through in the back seat during your car ride home from the video game store, in anticipation of being able to play your cool new game when you get home. I'll be looking through the Link's Awakening DX manual before I start actually playing the game, to make replaying Link's Awakening an authentic experience. So with that, let's take a look at the manual to see what this game's all about. The manual starts with a prologue story section to set the stage for what the player will expect on their adventure. Through this prologue, you learn that Link's Awakening takes place directly after A Link to the Past, where after Ganon is destroyed, the people of Hyrule are worried that a new evil might spawn out of Ganon's ashes. Link feels similarly to this, and in order to search for wisdom and enlightenment to use against a potential threat, he decides to hop on a boat and explore. After sailing around for months, Link was on his way home to Hyrule when a storm hit, and a lightning bolt struck his ship, destroying it. Eventually, Link washed up on a shore and thought he saw Princess Zelda standing above him, talking to him. However, this was actually a lady named Marin, who is a resident of Kanalet Island. I won't talk too much about the story of this game right now, because it picks up from this point when we actually start playing Link's Awakening. I think it's really cool how this game decides to take a spin on the Zelda formula, where this was the first Zelda game to not have Princess Zelda in it or take place in Hyrule. However, I think the story prologue to Link's Awakening seems a little forced regarding Link's reasoning towards leaving Hyrule. People in Hyrule, quote, knitted their brows and shook their heads because they were worried that an evil might spawn out of Ganon's ashes. You would think that they would be celebrating that Ganon was defeated and not be scared. I mean, they have zero reason to think that an evil will appear, and Link doesn't really have a good reason for searching for wisdom in case an evil power comes back. I think the prologue should have just stated that Link decided to hop on a boat and sail because he was thirsty for adventure, but I guess the story writers tried to make a connection with the Link to the Past in order to make the Zelda games feel connected and also to appeal to fans. The manual then explains the basics, such as the controls and how to play the game. I found this interesting section though, where it reads, the A button will let you talk to a villager, answer the telephone, or read a stone slab. While this game has villagers to talk to and the telephone that you use for hints, the DX version of Link's Awakening doesn't actually have stone slabs in it, where the original Game Boy release was the version that had stone slabs and dungeons that you read for hints, and the DX version changed these stone slabs to owl statues. So it looks like when someone was putting together this Link's Awakening DX manual, they didn't realize that the stone slabs were taken out of the remake, which is pretty funny. Heck, there's even a stone slabs and fragments section that says there's stone slabs in this game, when there's a picture of an owl statue literally right there. So anyway, moving on from that tangent, the manual then discusses the items you'll collect along your adventure, as well as some characters that you'll meet. The last section of the manual describes the new features of the DX version, where there's an additional dungeon called the Color Dungeon, which showcases the color capabilities of the Game Boy Color, as well as a photographer who takes pictures of Link throughout his quest, and you are able to print these pictures out using the Game Boy printer. I guess the photographer was added to the game to try to get people to purchase a Game Boy printer, which I guess was a neat novelty to have at the time, but this photographer was unsurprisingly removed from the Switch remake of Link's Awakening, probably due to how dated this printing feature is. So that about covers it for the game's manual. Let's start playing the game to see what it's all about. At the beginning of the game, you find yourself waking up in a bed after Marin brought you there upon finding you washed up on the shores of Kanalet Island. Link waking up at the beginning of the game has become a serious staple ever since A Link to the Past started the tradition. I'm not sure if the developers officially confirmed why this became a tradition for the Zelda series, but I think Link wakes up at the start of many of his games, because him waking up symbolizes the start of a new adventure for the player. This makes the beginning of the game relatable and comfortable for the player because they are exploring this brand new world in the shoes of Link. Also, Link being a silent protagonist aids the player in their ability to put themselves in Link's shoes, because without any dialogue from our hero, players are able to sort of think of themselves as being Link, exploring and being immersed in his world. That's sort of how I view Link in Zelda games, but let me know in the comments if there's anything you want to add to this. So after hopping out of bed, you can talk to a guy named Terran, who is Marin's father, and he gives you your shield back that you lost. The shield in this game is pretty unique because it can actually be equipped and unequipped, and used as an item with a press of the A or B button, similar to how you use the bombs or arrows, where when you hold a button, Link holds his shield in front of him to block attacks. Link's Awakening was actually the very first Zelda game to allow you to hold your shield in front of you with the press of a button, where in Zelda 1, Zelda 2, and A Link to the Past, Link always holds his shield in front of him, and all you have to do is face an enemy to block their attacks. I like how the shield works in Link's Awakening more than any other previous Zelda games, because it adds more depth and strategy to the combat. You can only have 2 items equipped at a time in this game, and putting your shield in one of your precious item slots allows you to have more defense, where you can bounce off enemies and block enemy attacks with it equipped. But having the shield equipped prevents you from using other precious items at your disposal. One may argue that only being able to have 2 items equipped at a time doesn't age well and makes having to constantly open up the pause menu a chore, and while I agree with this somewhat, I actually think the system works out pretty well and adds to the challenge of the game. While in combat, you have to constantly strategize the best item combinations to use at any given time or any given scenario, where you could have a traditional approach and use your sword in combination with your shield to strike enemies when they aren't attacking and use your shield when they're on the offense, where you could equip your sword and Pegasus boots at the same time and kamikaze into enemies, even though you might get hit, or you could be evasive and equip your Pegasus boots with your Rock's Feather and run and jump over enemies without defeating them. This game actually has a lot of combinations in which the player can utilize their 2 item slots. Heck, this game even introduced the bomb arrows in this series, where if you press the bomb button and immediately use your arrows, you can shoot a death missile at enemies from afar. So I think the developers of this game used the Game Boy's capabilities to perfection in planning the controls and gameplay for Link's Awakening. The Game Boy only has the start button, select button, the D-pad to move Link around, and the A and B buttons. The Super Nintendo had the additional L, R, Y, and X buttons, and I still think Link's Awakening controls better than A Link to the Past. Also in Link's Awakening, whenever you have to open up the pause menu to change out your items, it's not like it takes that long at all. The menu opens up instantaneously when you press the button, and you can swap out your items pretty fast. The only minor nitpick I have though is that whenever you move right from the ocarina, it cycles between the songs you know and doesn't actually move to the item to the right. I think the developers should have allowed you to choose which song you wanted to play when you actually use the ocarina item. That was just a slight annoyance really, where it wasn't really that big of a deal while I was playing. So moving on from that, I used my shield on some spiky boys and recovered my sword washed up on the beach. This is where you meet your sort of companion and hint giver in this game, which is an owl, who tells you that in order to leave the island you have to wake the windfish, who is located in a sealed egg at the center of the island. This owl was implemented pretty well in this game, I'd have to say, where it wasn't too overbearing as some Zelda companions, but he wasn't too cryptic where you had no idea where to go next. He oftentimes flies in to talk to the player right after large milestones, such as defeating each dungeon, and most of the time, he fills you in on some story fragments or points you in the general direction of where you're supposed to go next. He doesn't have much personality like some Zelda companions such as Linebeck or Midna, but he was a nice inclusion in this game, I feel like. In addition to the owl, there are these phone booths scattered throughout Koholint Island, where you can talk to a Mabe Village resident named Ulrira, who gives you even more detailed hints on what to do next, if you choose to listen to him. Some may say that this guy's hints reduces the amount of exploration you're required to do in the game to find where to go next, but I think this phone booth was a really nice feature. When I play Zelda games, I'm going to be looking for all the secrets anyway, so it's not like I'm cheating myself out of exploring if I use hints. Also, it's nice to have the option to know what specific place I have to go to or what specific person I have to talk to, in order to progress the main story if I get stuck. I think players should be able to play their games however they want to, and if they want to just play the main story and progress through it without doing much side content, I think they should be given that option. Also, it's not like you have to use the phone booth hint guide during your playthrough. He's just there if you want to hint. So after retrieving my sword, I went back up to Mabe Village, did some conversing with some villagers, and won a Yoshi doll in a crane minigame, which is the start of this game's long trading sequence, where you give NPCs one item for another, and that repeats itself until you finally get the magnifying glass, which is required to read a certain book that tells you the secret path you have to take in the windfish's egg at the end of the game, in order to beat Link's Awakening. A lot of people quote this trading sequence as their reason for disliking this game, but I actually never really found it much of a challenge for me during my playthrough. The map of Koholint Island isn't super big or anything, and if you just talk to every person and creature you see, and take note of what they say and what they want, you shouldn't have a problem completing this trading sequence. The only part of this quest that I found a bit challenging to figure out was finding the fisherman under a bridge and giving him the fishing hook in exchange for the mermaid's necklace, because you had to dive in the water on a specific tile next to a bridge to find him. I feel like I may have just gotten lucky, but I had no problem finding this guy. So after giving the Yoshi doll item in exchange for a ribbon to kick off the trading sequence, I followed the owl's guidance and made my way into the mysterious forest. This area was a pretty easy introductory area, where you have some branching paths to explore and some enemies to fight. Also, I think it's pretty funny how this game insults Link's weight, where a sign reads that a heavy person should not be standing on cracks on the floor, and when Link stands on one for too long, he falls through them. Big boy enemies like Gibdos are able to stand on them without any troubles, so I guess maybe Link is actually on the bigger side. Either that, or his endless void of an item satchel is weighing him down or something. So after making my way through the forest, I found a mushroom, gave it to a witch in exchange for some magic powder, and sprinkled some under Terran's nose to turn him back to normal, because after he ate a mushroom he found in the forest, he turned into a raccoon. I'm not sure what the developers were thinking when they included this in the game, but it's most definitely a drug reference. When you try to use the mushroom item, the game even reads, "You hold it over your head and a mellow aroma wafts into your nostrils." Like, what else could that be referring to? So after rescuing Terran, I snagged the first dungeon's key and made my way back to Mabe Village when I realized that you could literally murder cuckoos and dogs in this village. The Game Boy Link's Awakening is the only Zelda game where you're able to kill cuckoos, where in the Switch remake of Link's Awakening, being able to kill cuckoos was removed from the game entirely. I think Nintendo removed this from the Switch version because they didn't want to get negative attention on promoting animal cruelty, which was probably the best call for Nintendo in this situation. Normally in Zelda games, you are able to attack cuckoos, and eventually a cuckoo swarm swoops in to attack you, and while you can still activate this feature in Link's Awakening, I couldn't help but be surprised after discovering that you could murder cuckoos in this game. So after roasting some chickens, and walking by some Octoroks shooting cheese danishes at me, I made my way to the beach and entered the first dungeon in this game, Tail Cave. This first dungeon was pretty simple and linear, and pretty much just served as an introductory dungeon for the player to get used to the gameplay. The dungeons in this game are pretty similar to A Link to the Past dungeons, where you have locked doors, a dungeon map, a compass, and a boss to fight at the end called the Nightmare. Each dungeon in Link's Awakening even has a mini-boss you have to fight towards the middle of each dungeon, and I had to say that this game does a really good job of providing variety in its bosses that the player has to fight. A few of the mini-bosses would be repeated multiple times throughout the game, but each dungeon's boss was totally unique and not like the others. There are even smaller side dungeons with unique bosses in this game, outside of the main 8 dungeons that you have to trek through. One new aspect for this game's dungeons that didn't appear in any other Zelda game is the inclusion of owl statues, which you can talk to once you obtain the stone beak item from the statue's respective dungeon. These owl statues only appear in the DX version of Link's Awakening, where in the original version of Link's Awakening, these owl statues are actually called stone slabs, which I touched a bit on earlier. In Link's Awakening DX, the owl statues appear more often than the stone slabs, to offer more hints for the player to make their time easier. I guess Nintendo put these hints more frequently in the DX version, because they felt like the original on the Game Boy was too cryptic. I've never played the original Link's Awakening, so I can't speak on how the stone slabs in that game operate, but I feel like the owl statues were necessary to progress through the dungeon about half the time. The owl statues sometimes state trivial bits of information that would only be helpful for people unfamiliar with how Zelda games work, but a lot of the time, their hints are necessary to proceed, such as telling you the order you have to kill enemies to unlock a key, or telling you that you need to knock down all the pillars in a dungeon to beat it. Another aspect about this game that I want to cover, that most people are probably aware of already, are the numerous Mario references in this game, where many of the enemies are Mario enemies, where we have the Goombas and Bloopers. And many of the items and NPCs are references to Mario as well, where Terran is a reference to being Mario himself, complete with his habit of eating mushrooms. I'm not sure if there's a definitive reason why Nintendo chose to include so many Mario references in this game, but I think it's because Link's Awakening started as a side project at Nintendo for employees to work on during their off hours, and they were probably just having fun among themselves, including a bunch of Mario enemies in their game, and the enemies just kinda stuck there. Also, the game taking place in a dream sort of gives an excuse for all these wacky enemies to be there, since the story doesn't take place in Link's real world. So after exploring around the dungeon for a bit, I came across the Rock's Feather item, which lets Link jump, and made my way to the dungeon's boss, which is the Moldwar boss from A Link to the Past, and you had to keep smacking the tip of its tail to beat it. It wasn't too hard to take down, so I killed it and obtained the Full Moon Cello. Once out of the dungeon, you find the owl who tells you that you need to collect all 8 instruments in order to wake up the Windfish and leave the island. The owl also says something that I find interesting, where he says, "I was instructed to give you directions," and tells you what part of the map to go to next. This made me wonder, who is instructing the owl to give Link directions on where to go? When I saw this piece of dialogue at this point in the game when I was playing, I thought that the Windfish was instructing the owl to help Link, but how would that make any sense if the Windfish is asleep? At the end of the game, this mystery is solved where the owl reveals that he is actually part of the Windfish's spirit, so the owl is actually the Windfish pointing Link in the right direction to wake him up. And the Windfish wants to wake up because the Nightmare bosses evidently cursed him to be asleep so they could thrive in this imaginary dream world. In addition to the owl statues in the dungeons and the owl that you talk to every now and then, there are these purple-looking owl statues scattered throughout the overworld that you can speak to, and they usually provide cryptic hints or vague plot elements that don't make much sense. Their dialogue takes some time to figure out what they're talking about, but I feel like their cryptic nature is supposed to add to the mystery of this game. As you complete each dungeon, the owl reveals more and more plot fragments regarding the existence of the Windfish and Koholint Island, which offers plot progression as you play through the game. At the beginning of the game, you have no idea what the island is, but by the end of the game, everything comes together and makes sense. It's pretty remarkable how Nintendo was able to provide such a dynamic story on such a limited piece of hardware. Link's Awakening has arguably the best story of any game on the original Game Boy, and definitely has the best story of any Zelda game at the point of this game's release in 1993, in my opinion. So from this point, I wandered around the village some more, and figured out that you're able to rifle through people's drawers. Every single time I went into a new house, I would check the drawers and would always come across the same message that reads, "Wow, this is a nice chest." I'm not sure why it was coded in the game that you could check drawers like this, when it doesn't even do anything. Maybe at some point in development, it was planned that Link would sometimes find items in these drawers in people's houses. I'm not sure if I checked every single drawer, so let me know in the comments if you know of any drawers in this game that provide a different piece of dialogue when you check it, other than the "Wow, this is a nice chest" text. After saving a chain shop named Bow Wow, who was kidnapped by some bad guys, I was able to use him to clear a path in the swamp to get to the second dungeon in this game, called Bottle Grotto. This dungeon made me realize some nitpicks that I have with Link's Awakening DX that are a bit annoying to experience, where the largest nitpick revolves around the repetitive and unwanted dialogue. There are jars and rocks in this game that you're able to only pick up when you obtain the Power Bracelet item that's located in this second dungeon, but before you get the Power Bracelet, every single time that you so much as graze one of these jars or rocks, the game stops you in your tracks and makes you read some unwanted dialogue about how the objects are too heavy for you to lift. I feel like one instance of this text popping up would be enough, but for it to pop up every single time that you touch one of these jars or rocks, that seems a bit excessive. It gets even worse than this though, when later in the game, you come across these crystals on the ground. With the jars and rocks, the heavy object dialogue disappears once you obtain the Power Bracelet item, but with these floor crystals, every time you touch one of these things without your Pegasus boots equipped, you get a bunch of slow-moving text that you have to mash the A button to get through. Also in this game, there are temporary power-ups that the enemies can drop, where one is called the Guardian Acorn, that gives you a temporary defense boost, and the other is the Piece of Power, that gives you a temporary offense boost. These items are pretty cool in theory, but every single time you come across one, you have to sit through the dialogue where it explains what the item is. Also, it doesn't help that the music for these power-ups is super repetitive and hard to listen to for long periods of time, where the music and the power-up only stop when you take a certain amount of damage. Oftentimes, I would actively avoid picking up these power-ups because it wasn't worth it for me to listen to that jingle and sit through that dialogue. I haven't played much of the Switch remake of this game, so I'm not sure how that game plays entirely, but based on my research, the Switch version provides a lot of quality of life improvements that fix a lot of the problems I just described. This dungeon also made me realize a common flaw for this game, in my opinion, that would also appear in later dungeons: the lack of good puzzles. When it comes to combat, Link's Awakening DX really excels, where it can be pretty challenging at times, but it's hard to really call many of these puzzles in this game puzzles at all, where they don't really require the player to think. Oftentimes, the game tells you exactly what you need to do, such as in the second dungeon, you have to find an owl statue that tells you the exact order of which you need to kill a group of enemies to proceed. There's no puzzle here. The game just straight up tells you exactly what you need to do. There are more examples of this that I'll bring up later in the video, and it wasn't until the 7th and 8th dungeons of this game, and partly the color dungeon, where I thought that the puzzles were done nicely at a consistent level, with some minor exceptions. The puzzles in dungeons 1 through 6 sort of just blended together, and the only thing that made each dungeon progressively harder was that the combat got progressively more challenging. I understand that coming up with good puzzles in games can be super complex, and maybe the Game Boy's hardware wasn't even capable for allowing for complex dungeons and puzzles, so that may be why the developer has kept things pretty simple, for the most part. Or maybe the developer has intentionally dumbed down the puzzles in this game for it to be more accessible for younger audience playing this game. Also, I know that a lot of these critiques can come across as me disliking this game, but I actually had a lot of fun during my playthrough. This is just me analyzing this game at a high level and pointing out in my opinion on how it excels, as well as its setbacks. So after obtaining the Power Bracelet item, I made my way into the boss's chamber and was greeted by a pretty unique boss, which looked to be a genie in a bottle, and in order to defeat it, you have to utilize your newly acquired Power Bracelet. This boss was actually pretty challenging and killed me a few times, where its second phase was super tough, as it teleports around and chucks fire at you after you break its bottle. All in all, this dungeon was a pretty fun experience, where the combat was a bit more challenging than the first dungeon, but there was a noticeable lack of puzzles. So with that, I exited the dungeon and made my way to the prairie. While I was exploring the prairie, I came across this structure which acts as a warp point, where when you fall in the hole, it unlocks that structure as a warp point that you can teleport to, upon unlocking similar looking structures scattered across the overworld. And the only way to teleport in this game is by entering one of these structures. After playing Zelda 1, Zelda 2, and A Link to the Past for this channel, I'd have to say that Link's Awakening DX has the best warp system out of all these games up until its release. Zelda 1 had a warp system that I'm pretty sure wasn't explained at all by the game, where if you used the recorder item while facing north or east, you warp to the next dungeon you cleared, and if you use the recorder item while facing south or west, you warp to the previous dungeon you cleared. Zelda 2 didn't have a warp system, and in A Link to the Past, you don't unlock the warp system until pretty late in the game, which could have been beneficial to use earlier on. In Link's Awakening, however, you unlock a warp point when you physically explore and discover the warp teleport structures. So there's a nice progression where as you explore more, you unlock more warp points, making traversing Kanalet Island easier. I also like Link's Awakening overworld map screen more than any other previous Zelda's map, where the map only shows detail for map tiles that you physically have been to. This works really well because it gives the player the impression that they're filling out their map as they're traversing the island. Also, it wouldn't make any sense if Link had a fully filled out map from the start, considering he's never been to the island before. I also think that the game graying out map tiles in the map screen that you haven't been to is super helpful because it allows the player to see what areas they haven't explored, and if they're not sure on where to go next, they can just look at the map and try to go where the grayed out squares are. While I was exploring the prairie, I also started to find a few of these collectibles called magic seashells, which unlock an upgraded sword once you find 20 of them. I love collectibles in video games, and I think that generally, the more there are the better, but I think they could have been implemented a little bit better in Link's Awakening DX. There are 3 total prizes you can win in this game at the Seashell Mansion upon reaching certain seashell count milestones, but the first 2 milestones each literally reward you with another seashell. That's plain useless because they aren't even useful to Link in his quest at all, and the amount of seashells that you need to collect to unlock the upgraded sword might as well just be set to 18 seashells instead of 20. As I kept exploring, I came across this guy named Richard, who informs you that he used to live in Kanalet Castle, and his servants betrayed him and forced him to leave. He also tells Link that he'll give him the key to the next dungeon if he retrieves the golden leaves that Richard left behind in the castle. This whole situation seemed kinda random and wacky, but nevertheless, I went to the castle and started hunting for leaves. In order to infiltrate the castle, you have to break a bush to the right of the castle and enter it from the basement. Sound familiar? Well, this is an obvious reference towards the beginning of A Link to the Past that I guess the developers were having fun with. Exploring the castle and hunting for leaves was pretty fun, but I was pretty stumped in trying to find the last hidden leaf. When I talked to Richard, he said something about needing a shovel, so I viewed that as a hint that one of the leaves would be hidden in the grass somewhere, and I had to dig it up to find it. So I spent the next 5 minutes digging up every single diggable spot surrounding the castle, but found no golden leaf. So I wandered around the inside of the castle for a bit, tried bombing some suspicious looking wall art, and to my surprise, there was a golden leaf in one of them. So with all the golden leaves, I gave them to Richard, copped the slime key, and entered dungeon number 3, Key Cavern. This dungeon was probably my third favorite in the game because it had a pretty interesting gimmick of requiring the player to find a bunch of keys, and once you find all the keys, you were able to unlock a row of lockboxes and progress. This dungeon made me appreciate a feature of this game's compasses, where once you obtain the dungeon's compass, a jingle sounds when there's a key in a room that you haven't obtained yet. This is super helpful because many of the keys in this game are pretty well hidden and are oftentimes not located in plain sight in a chest or something. Also, one kind of random thing is I'm pretty sure I activated some sort of glitch in this game, where as I was fighting the mini-boss, I went down a screen and back again, without killing the second Dodongo snake, and somehow it self-destructed during that process. Let me know in the comments if you understand what happened here. Also, one pretty funny aspect about this game is that sometimes when you open a chest, a green Zol pops out and an error sound effect plays, indicating that you made a mistake. In A Link to the Past, the Zelda game that introduced the chest always contains something helpful, so it's pretty funny to see enemies pop out of the chests in Link's Awakening every once in a while to spice things up. So after exploring around the dungeon for a bit more, I obtained the Pegasus Boots item, which lets Link sprint. Link doesn't move that much faster with this item in this game, but it was necessary to progress in certain areas. This dungeon actually had a pretty cool puzzle, despite the first 6 dungeons generally lacking in puzzles, where you have to use your Pegasus Boots in conjunction with your Roc's Feather to run and jump over a large pit. It really requires you to think outside the box, and that's what makes puzzle sections good in Zelda games, in my opinion. After obtaining all the needed keys, I made my way to the dungeon's boss, which was one of my favorites in the whole game. The boss fight starts out with Zol enemies dripping from the ceiling, and you have to ram into the side of the room with your Pegasus Boots to make the Slime Eye boss fall from the ceiling so that you can attack it. I think there's a good chance that this boss was an inspiration for the Goma boss from Ocarina of Time, where both bosses start from the ceiling and drop lower level enemies down below for Link to fight. In order to defeat the slime eye in Link's Awakening, you have to continuously ram into it with your Pegasus boots until you slice it down in the middle to form 2 eyes. In this second phase of the fight, the eyeballs start ground pounding the floor, which stuns Link when he's touching the ground. So you have to jump at the right time with your Rock's Feather so that you don't get stunned, and swipe at the eyeballs with your sword until they're defeated. After defeating the boss, I picked up my heart container and collected the Sea Lily's Bell. From here, I went back to Maeve Village to check up on things, and found that I was now able to access the house with my power bracelet, and found a bed sitting on the top of a platform, which you are able to lie in and go to sleep. Once asleep, you start drifting into a dream and find yourself in a room where you're able to collect the ocarina. This is super trippy because Link's essentially dreaming inside of the Windfish's dream, so this is basically the Zelda equivalent of the Inception movie. The ocarina item you obtain in this dream is pretty important because it lets you learn songs later in the game that are crucial towards progressing through your adventure. So after learning the Ballad of the Windfish song from Marin, and conversing with this kid who seemingly became sentient to the fact that he's living in a video game, I kept exploring around and found this one patch of grass towards the right of Maeve Village that infuriated me because I'm pretty sure there's absolutely no way of cutting it. When you enter the screen to be with the grass, you appear right on top of it, so you can't even swing your sword to cut it. That blade of grass could have the 4th piece of the Triforce in it, and we wouldn't even be able to access it. So sad. From here, I did some exploring and found a sandy area with a bunch of Armos enemies that destroyed my health, but I was able to make it to a side dungeon with an Armos Knight boss, which is one of the 2 reasons why my death count upon beating this game was a whopping 22 deaths. I'll touch on the second reason why my death counter was so high towards the end of this video. This guy was so hard though, because he takes a whole 1.5 hearts away when you touch him, and the only way I was able to damage him was ramming into him with my sword and Pegasus boots, where normal sword swipes wouldn't work. Using this method was especially hard towards the end of the fight, because as you do more damage to the guy, he starts moving around crazy fast, which doesn't give you much time at all to charge your Pegasus boots dash. I think the intended way to kill this guy is through using the bow and arrows, because in the room before the boss, the pots contain arrows, but I didn't have 980 rupees to buy the bow at this point in the game, so I couldn't test this theory. Also, I wasn't trying to steal the bow because I'm not trying to be electrocuted and be called a thief by every NPC under the sun for the rest of the game. I was about to totally quit this boss fight due to dying so many times, until by some crazy stroke of luck, this happened. I have literally no idea what happened here. I think the gods of Hyrule took hold of my controller and killed the boss, because there's no way I could replicate whatever the heck happened here. This had to have been a glitch because I don't think there's any way for Link to run in place like this with the Pegasus boots during normal gameplay. In rewatching the footage for this video, I think that the boss ground pounded and stunned Link while he was in his running animation with his sword, causing the boss to be boxed in a corner until it was defeated. Let me know in the comments if you think something else happened here, because I'm almost certain this had to be a glitch, and I've never experienced something like this in the game before. But anyway, I'm glad it worked in my favor, so I went to the next room and collected the face key, which is actually the key for the 6th dungeon in this game, despite me only defeating the first 3 dungeons up until this point. The 8 dungeons in Link's Awakening have to be defeated in a certain order, but you can do side dungeons and missions out of order sometimes. This is pretty nice as it can give some customizability for how this game can be played. From here, I did some more exploring around the overworld, and stumbled across Marin along the shores of the beach, and witnessed a heartfelt cutscene between her and Link, where she tells him that she wishes she was a seagull so that she could fly far away and sing to people in a far-off land. There are a few cutscenes and moments like this in the game that makes the player feel an attachment towards Marin. It's almost sad because the goal of your quest in Kanalet Island is to wake the Windfish, which would allow Link to return to Hyrule, but at the same time, that would cause the island to disappear, and Marin to disappear with it. This dynamic here is what makes Link's Awakening have one of the best stories out of all the Zelda games, and to think Nintendo was able to accomplish that on this brick from 1989. There's actually a super secret scene in this game, where if you beat the game without dying at all, during the closing cutscene of the game, you can witness Marin take the form of a seagull and fly off in the distance, indicating that the Windfish granted her wish, allowing her to survive the destruction of Kanalet Island and fly away as a seagull. So after this emotional scene with Link and Marin on the beach, Link holds Marin up like a newly obtained item, and Marin agrees to join Link in waking up a walrus, so that he can progress towards fulfilling his mission of waking the Windfish. After Marin sings to the walrus and it dances itself off a cliff, she goes back to Animal Village, and holy, what the heck kind of ugly crow looking thing is that? We've got all these cute bunnies surrounding Marin singing her song, but that deformed black duck thing looks like its eyes are sliding off its face. That abomination looks like it could be that Takuri enemy from Majora's Mask that steals Link's items. They're both the same kind of ugly looking. So moving on from that, I made my way to the desert, and killed this thing that looks to be the Landmola boss from A Link to the Past, and obtained the Angler Key, which is the key to the next dungeon. So from here, I made my way straight to dungeon number 4, Angler's Tunnel. This dungeon is sort of like a water dungeon, minus the confusing water level changing mechanic from Ocarina of Time. All in all, this dungeon wasn't that impressive, where the only puzzle was this section where you had to step on these switches in the correct order to unlock a secret passage. But it wasn't really a puzzle at all, because all you have to do is keep testing different orders until the secret passage opens up through trial and error. The game wants you to memorize the order that you're supposed to hit the switches by seeing how they're lit up in a separate room, but that's not even required to do with the trial and error method. Also, the combat in this dungeon wasn't all that challenging or impressive, where it was about as hard as the second dungeon's combat. You do find a useful item in this dungeon though, the flippers, which allow you to swim across bodies of water without sinking like a rock, and allowing you to swim under the water in a 2D side-scroller areas. The boss for this dungeon was the worst in the entire game by a long shot, which is pretty infamous for being bad, where we have the angler fish, which can be killed in approximately 5 seconds, and just swims up and down while barely even attempting to attack Link. For Zelda games, normally, the dungeons increasingly get harder to balance the game, but this 4th dungeon felt about as hard as the 2nd dungeon, and was pretty unremarkable. It wasn't bad by any means, and I still had fun playing through it, but it was a bit too basic for it to be the 4th dungeon in this game. So once obtaining the Surf Harp, I exited the dungeon. From here, I swam a short distance to the left and found this ugly looking fish who sang an 8-bit rendition of the Tequila song. After the singing stopped, Link learned a new song that allows him to teleport to Manbo Pond, which is not much of a pond, and is just a small puddle next to Crazy Tracy's house. I actually use this warp quite a bit, though, because Crazy Tracy sells you a very cheap potion that you're able to rub all over yourself, and once you die, your health automatically gets restored. It was super worth it to buy one of these whenever I ran out, although I found it pretty odd how you have to rub it all over your body as a precautionary measure for when you lose all your hearts. Like, that doesn't even make any sense. Why couldn't she just sell you fairies like a normal Zelda game, instead of making Link lather up and get all lubed up in some mystery ointment? Whatever, I guess we'll give Crazy Tracy a pass. I'm sure she has her reasons. From here, a ghost appeared out of nowhere, started following me around, and asked me to take them to a house by the bay that it used to live in. So I took it to the only creepy looking abandoned house I knew. Upon doing this, the ghost then asked me to take him to his grave, which I tried to do as quickly as possible because of his super annoying sound this ghost makes whenever there's a screen transition. Listen to this. Every single time there's a screen transition, that annoying jingle happens, and I just wanted to get him back to his grave because of how annoying it was. Luckily, I found his grave without going too insane, but I feel bad for the players who had a hard time finding his house or grave because of how annoying he is. Also, every once in a while, he repeats the same dialogue where he asks you to take him somewhere, and I'm pretty sure the only way to get rid of him is to bring him to where he wants. Also, worst of all, when you bring him back to his grave, all he gives you as a reward is a measly secret shell, which is better than nothing, but you can find these things pretty much all over the place. At this point, the owl does make an appearance and gives you a hint on where to find the 5th dungeon, so I guess the process of guiding the ghost isn't all that useless. Bringing the ghost to its grave doesn't seem like it's required to beat the game, but if you want to keep your sanity and not hear its annoying noises, then you definitely want to get rid of this thing as soon as possible. From here, I made some strides towards completing the game-long trading sequence, when I gave Christine the goat in Animal Village a hibiscus in exchange for a love letter that she wanted me to hand-deliver to Mr. Wright, who lives pretty isolated from the rest of the NPCs. You learn that this is a love letter when you see the contents, where it's a literal picture of Princess Peach that's signed by Christine with a heart, so Christine is basically a catfish who's toying with Mr. Wright's emotions. You have to feel bad for Mr. Wright here. Link is mute and can't tell Mr. Wright the truth, but you can tell that Link wants to deep down. So moving on from that, I dove in the water around the spot that the owl told me, and made my way into the 5th dungeon of this game, Catfish's Maw. This dungeon was one of the better ones in the game, where it has this cool skeleton guy that you had to fight 4 times to get the hookshot, and there was this pretty fun Goma boss that I actually defeated after I beat the main boss of the dungeon, because it's not required to beat the game, and just unlocks a warp point to the dungeon's entrance. Also, I touched a bit on this earlier, but this game has a lot of 2D side-scroller areas that you have to traverse, and you have to use your Rock's Feather to jump around like Mario. These areas even have a lot of elements from Super Mario, such as these teeter-totter platform things, as well as Mario enemies such as bloopers and piranha plants. I thought these areas were a nice change of pace from the obligatory top-down Zelda experience, and Link's Awakening wasn't actually the first Zelda game to have these 2D side-scroller areas, where Zelda 2's combat solely took place in a 2D side-scroller, and Zelda 1 even had some sections like this. So as I kept exploring the dungeon, I made my way to the boss, which was actually pretty challenging, and was this segmented eel-looking thing that swung its spiked tail around a center pit, as you had to use your hookshot on its head to pull it out of the wall and smack at its heart. After I knocked it out with one heart remaining, I collected the wind and marimba instrument. All in all, this dungeon was pretty fun, especially in combat, but there weren't really any puzzles at all, which made this dungeon not require much brain power to get through. So moving on from that, I finally had enough rupees to buy the most expensive item in the game, which is actually required to beat Link's Awakening, the bow, which costs a whopping 980 rupees. That's pretty insane for a piece of string tied to a stick, if you ask me. And I find it hilarious how inexpensive the arrows are in this guy's shop, where each arrow only costs 1 rupee. Talk about unbalanced prices. I think the developers hiked up the bow's prices in this game because they wanted to balance the player's rupee intake amounts and the rupee spending amounts, where there aren't many things to use your rupees on at all, besides the shovel, making this frog guy sing a song later in the game, and the bow itself. Also, you don't need the bow until late in the game anyway, so you probably won't be grinding for rupees to buy the thing by the time that you actually need it. I like that this game doesn't really have any wallet upgrades, like how many future Zelda games have it. In Link's Awakening, you're always able to hold the maximum amount of rupees. Nothing's more annoying than opening a chest and realizing that you don't have a big enough wallet yet, and it all goes to waste. So from here, I took out my face key that I found earlier, and unlocked and entered the 6th dungeon of this game, Face Shrine. This dungeon had a pretty cool and ominous atmosphere, with its dungeon layout being shaped like a masked beast, and its bleak and almost hopeless music. Listen to this. At this point in the game, you pretty much know that waking up the windfish will make all the NPCs that you grew fond of in this world disappear, but you push on anyway because you have to get back to your own world and escape this dream. This dungeon didn't really have any puzzle elements, but it had a lot of non-linear aspects with backtracking into previous rooms that added towards the challenge of getting through this maze of a dungeon. One problem I had with this dungeon though, is that oftentimes, when you defeat a group of enemies in a sealed room to unlock the exit, and come back shortly after, the enemies oftentimes respawn very quickly, and you have to fight them over and over again every single time you enter their room. The amount of backtracking required in this dungeon makes this a little bit annoying. Like, I killed this group of Wizrobes probably like 10 times in total. Another slightly annoying part about this dungeon was these chest pieces that you had to toss, and only when both of them land upright, a secret is unlocked for you to be able to progress. I'm pretty sure how they land is entirely based on luck in this game, so I just stood facing a wall, spamming the power bracelet, until they landed upright. It would have been pretty cool if the developers added some strategy or puzzle elements towards how they're supposed to land. Also, one owl statue that kind of left a bad taste in my mouth was this one that tells you have to smash a pot in the chest to open it, and the chest that you need to smash open is located directly next to the owl statue that gives the hint. There are similar instances with these owl statues in this game's dungeons, where they oftentimes tell you the exact solution of a puzzle, without requiring the player to think much, and I think it could have been handled a little bit better. For instance, if the game introduced the mechanic early on that smashing pots into chests unlocks them, and then required the player to remember that mechanic in this dungeon, possibly with another spin put on it, then that would have been a pretty good puzzle element. Instead, this dungeon has some one-off event where you have to throw a pot in a chest that only happens once in this game, and there's a hint directly next to the chest telling you exactly what you need to do. It's just mindless for the player if you ask me. Moving on from that tangent, the combat section in this dungeons were pretty nice, similar to the rest of the dungeons, and the boss was pretty cool, where you have to use trial and error to find out its weak point, which is the bombs, and bomb it until it dies. When it dies, it also fills the player in on some lore, where it's the first time that the game blatantly tells a player that waking up the windfish will destroy the entire world of Kanalet. This is interesting, because it feels like the bosses that you have to defeat are trying to convince Link to not wake up the windfish, because they want to thrive in this imaginary dream world. But what doesn't make any sense to me is why are the villagers of May Village not trying to stop Link from waking up the windfish? When the windfish wakes up, all of them will disappear as well, so wouldn't they not want to be erased from existence? Marin even goes out of her way to help Link in his adventure by singing to the walrus to move it out of the way to let Link proceed. My only guess is that Link is keeping it a secret that waking up the windfish will destroy Kanalet Island and erase all of its inhabitants. But let me know in the comments what you think about this. So anyway, from here, I collected the coral triangle and exited the dungeon. From here, I did some more exploring around the overworld, and came across this maze that led to a frog guy named Mamu, who taught me a song to wake up dead things. After listening to probably the hardest song to listen to in this game, just listen to this. I'm not sure if the developers intentionally made the song sound bad as a joke, but I think it was intentional because even the Switch version of the song sounds annoying. There are some annoying parts of songs in Link's Awakening that do seem unintentionally bad though, like when you play the 8 instruments of the siren in front of the windfish. Listen to this. That just sounds like someone farting. It's easy to hate on the original Game Boy's audio capabilities, but all in all, I think the soundtrack of this game is extremely well done, considering the hardware limitations of the time. And all the songs in this game fit the mood nicely when they are played. Also, I think it's impressive that each of the main 8 dungeons in this game had their own unique song, and they're all pretty good sounding. To put that in perspective, A Link to the Past only had 2 unique dungeon songs, and Link's Awakening was released on weaker hardware. So from here, I used the Resurrection song that was taught to me by Mabu, also known as Wart from Super Mario Bros. 2, and resurrected a blue rooster that I used to cross a large pit in order to make it to the 7th dungeon of this game, Eagle's Tower. And boy, this dungeon was a doozy, and it was a massive difficulty spike from Dungeon 6, but it was definitely my favorite dungeon in the game. This dungeon had the best puzzle elements in Link's Awakening, which were made possible due to the dungeon's layout, which was the only one in the game to have multiple floors, and you can fall to floors below you by falling down pits. This ability to fall to floors below you requires you to have a high level of spatial awareness, and that's what made me like the dungeons in A Link to the Past so much. What also made Eagle's Tower challenging is this dungeon introduces the puzzle element of needing to route a ball throughout rooms, to knock down pillars in order to change the dungeon's layout to progress, as well as requiring the player to hit a color switch the correct way multiple times to progress throughout areas without blocking yourself. This dungeon actually took me a lot of brain power to get through, and I could definitely see people having a hard time with this one, especially considering how much harder it is compared to the previous dungeons in this game. Also, the combat was pretty challenging, with these Gibdos that take a lot of hits to kill, and don't take much knockback, as well as this decently challenging mini-boss that's able to knock you down to a lower floor, hindering your progress. After stumbling around for a bit, I eventually found the Mirror Shield, which is able to block more types of attacks compared to Link's regular shield, and after knocking down all the pillars, the ceiling caved in and I made my way higher up the tower. After some more trekking around upstairs, I made my way to the boss, where you fight the evil eagle at the top of the tower. This guy probably caused me more of a headache than it should have, where this boss was the second reason why my final death counter in this game was so high. For some reason, I had a really hard time trying to figure out the correct way to kill this guy, because whenever he started his wind attack, I kept getting blown off and couldn't find a way to stay on the tower. And the worst thing is that when you get knocked off, the boss regains all of its health when you climb up the ladder again. During the wind attack, I kept trying to sprint with my Pegasus boots against the winds, but for whatever reason, that didn't seem to work to stay on the tower. After a lot of trial and error, I eventually discovered that all you need to do is equip your newly acquired Mirror Shield and walk against the wind, as the Mirror Shield is able to block the feathers that the bird chucks at you. So with that information in mind, I was able to knock out the evil eagle without too much trouble, and I collected the next instrument, Organ of Evening Calm. From here, I made my way west, and had a heartfelt moment with Marin, where Link saves her and she says, "I don't know how to say this, but..." And Terran interrupts the scene and beckons Marin to come with her. I'm not sure if it's established among the Zelda community on what Marin was about to say here, but I think it has something to do with the standard movie/TV show cliche of the bumbling sidekick interrupting a romantic moment between two couples. So I'm pretty sure Marin was about to say something about not wanting Link to leave the island, because she really likes him. Once Marin runs away, the owl swoops in and tells Link that apparently Marin paid a visit to the windfish and tried singing her a song to the egg, apparently in an attempt to wake the windfish, but was evidently unsuccessful because only the song of the instruments of the sirens are able to wake him up. It's unclear if Marin knows at this point that waking the windfish will make herself and the island disappear, but I think she's saying to the windfish in an attempt to wake it up, and wish to it that she wants to be a seagull and fly off to a far land. Earlier on in the game, there's even a cutscene where she ponders to Link, wishing the very same thing of being a seagull to the windfish. So from here, I made my way west a little more, and made my way into the 8th dungeon of this game, Turtle Rock. This dungeon was my second favorite in the game, was pretty challenging combat-wise, and actually had a pretty interesting puzzle mechanic, where you had to push this platform and guide it around using the D-pad. This dungeon was also pretty large and felt like a maze to get through, and find the correct paths to progress. By this point in the game, I also came to realize how overpowered the hookshot is as a weapon. Just look at how it destroyed this mini-boss. I'm pretty sure the Switch version of Link's Awakening nerfed this thing, based on my research, and that's no surprise because this thing is really useful. As I kept trekking around through the dungeon, I eventually stumbled across this mini-boss that has no pushover, because it can literally punch you to the beginning of the dungeon. That's pretty hardcore right there. He was pretty hard to kill because when you try to hit him from the front, you are unable to deal damage because of his boxing gloves absorbing the attack. So after being sent to the beginning of the dungeon a few times, I finally found a technique of killing this guy, where you can just repeatedly ram into him with your sword and Pegasus boots until he dies. After knocking this guy out, I wasn't sure where to go next, but through looking at my map at the rooms I hadn't explored yet, I figured out that you need to bomb a wall in order to get to a neighboring room with a hidden switch, even though there weren't cracks in the wall. I was fine with this because I was still able to find the room using the dungeon map, but I think it's a little lame how these switches don't change color between red and blue when you hit them, so there's no way of knowing the status of the switch from just looking at it. I get that this game was released for the original Game Boy, so there wasn't any color, but the color switch could have at least been programmed to toggle between white and black. Either way, it's not that crazy of a big deal, but it was just something minor that I noticed. After some more walking arounds, I got the magic rod that looks more like a lollipop than anything, and I was able to melt these ice blocks with it to progress. There were a couple of 2D side-scroller areas where you have to melt the ice to proceed, and I was pretty impressed with the puzzle elements for these areas. In these rooms, you have to be careful which direction you're facing to melt the ice in a way such that you're clearing a path for yourself without destroying the floor that you have to walk on. From here, I made my way into the boss chamber, which was so easy. It was a fiery face-looking thing that hopped around, and if you spam your magic rod at it over and over again, it gets stunned in place and can be killed almost instantaneously. I would say that this boss kinda sucked, which it arguably does, but it was a bit satisfying to kill this guy super fast. So from here, I made my way into the next room and collected the last of the 8 instruments, the Thunder Drum. From here, I made my way into the library with my magnifying glass, after completing the game-long trading sequence, and read a book to unlock the secret route that you had to take to access the boss and the Windfish Egg. Once at the Windfish Egg, I played the 8 instruments of the Siren, busted a hole in the egg, took the secret route, and made my way into the final boss chamber. This was a super cool boss, albeit not that challenging, but I think it worked really well for this game. This thing has many phases, which look very similar to previous bosses you fight in this game, so this whole boss fight really ties everything together. There's a phase that references the final boss fight from A Link to the Past, and there's even a cool fake-out ending, where the music cuts out for a second, until the final form of the boss is revealed, where you have to jump over his arms with your rock's feather, while shooting it in the eye when it opens. The only thing that kinda sucked for me though, during my first attempt at this guy, is that I ran out of arrows during the fight, so I had no choice but to accept death, buy some more arrows at the shop, and start the boss fight over again. That wasn't that big of a deal though, so I managed to kill the beast, climb the stairs to the Windfish, and witness the Windfish awaken as Kanalet Island disappeared, along with all of its inhabitants. During the end scene, you see the Windfish fly overhead your destroyed ship as you wake up, confirming that the Windfish is actually a real entity in Hyrule that was just dreaming up Kanalet Island. And now Link has a new problem of being stranded in the middle of the ocean with no food and water. But the credits start to roll, so I guess that's Link's problem, and not ours. That's not the end of our quest though, because there's a bit of side content that I actually did after beating the final boss. For one, I never obtained the Kanalet Sword, also known as the level 2 sword, which is only obtainable after you collect 20 secret seashells scattered throughout Kanalet Island. I only found 19 of them up until the final boss, and I found one more, which equaled 20, and I got a new sword, which increases your attack damage, as well as allowing you to shoot sword beams out of your sword when you have full health. I also went ahead and obtained the boomerang item, which I googled the location of after I beat the game, because this thing is pretty well hidden. Once you obtain the magnifying glass item late in the game, you are able to see this guy in a cave near the beach, and he lets you trade one of your items for the boomerang. What made this guy hard to find is that I entered this cave towards the beginning of the game, before I found the magnifying glass, but when I saw that nothing was in there, I never came back again. Also, once you get the magnifying glass item towards the end of the game, you don't really have a reason to go back to the beach area, because that's the starting area of the game where the very first dungeon is located. It looks like the boomerang is just a cool novelty item that's pretty powerful, that the developers added as a reward for fans who try to go out of their way to explore everything. I also haven't touched on the secret dungeon in Link's Awakening DX, called the Color Dungeon. A clue to open up the entrance to this dungeon can be found by ramming into the bookcase in the May Village Library, and knocking down a book that contains the order that you have to push some gravestones in the graveyard to unlock the dungeon's entrance. Honestly, I'm a little surprised how hidden the developers made this dungeon. I actually had to look up how to get to the Color Dungeon after I beat the game, and you'd expect the developers to make this dungeon pretty easy to find, considering it was a huge selling point for the DX version of Link's Awakening. Anyway, I pushed some gravestones and made my way into the Color Dungeon. This dungeon wasn't all that remarkable, and mainly just existed to showcase the color capabilities of the Game Boy Color. It was pretty short and linear, but there were a couple of interesting color gimmick sections where you had to hit switches to make them change color, and you had to use your brain to make them all the same color. Or you could just swing at them randomly until by chance, they all turn into the same color, which is honestly what I did, I'm not afraid to admit. This dungeon also has a secret room with green rupees, each worth 5 rupees, which is actually the only area in the game where these things exist, which is pretty neat. This dungeon also has 2 mini-bosses that make their debut here, which are pretty cool, where you have this massive buzz blob that you had to sprinkle some magic powder on to kill, as well as this cool looking boulder guy. The boss in the color dungeon was also pretty cool, where you had to keep attacking it quickly by making it turn from blue to red, but it tells you exactly how to kill it over and over again during the fight, which makes the whole experience seem a tad underwhelming. Once this thing is defeated, you go to the next room and have the option to be either given the red tunic, which increases your damage dealt, or the blue tunic that increases your defense. This was literally the last thing I did in the game, so my choice didn't really matter much, but I just went with the blue tunic because why not? So that's Link's Awakening DX, released for the Game Boy and Game Boy Color in 1998. I had super fun playing this game, which took me about 15 hours to finish. I don't quite enjoy this game as much as other top-down Zelda games such as Link to the Past, but it's remarkable how much Nintendo was able to do with such limited hardware. I definitely think this game is miles ahead of Zelda 1 and Zelda 2 on the NES, I would have to say. The combat, gameplay, and enemy variety was well done in Link's Awakening, but I feel like the puzzle elements were a bit lacking in the game, and they only really get good in Dungeons 7 and 8, which are Eagle's Tower and Turtle Rock respectively. I do think the story of this game is one of the best in the series, and the plot development in this game even rivals many of the 3D Zelda games' plots, in my opinion. Many people commonly ask the question of, if I've never played a Zelda game before, what game is a good place to start? If I were asked that question, I would say Link's Awakening. This game is not cryptic by any means, and explains how Zelda games work at a pretty basic level from the beginning. Also, the puzzles are not that difficult in this game, besides the later dungeons, so it's not likely that you'll get totally stuck in this game, even if you're unfamiliar with how Zelda games work. There are 3 versions for Link's Awakening that were released, where we have the original for the Game Boy released in 1993, the DX version that I just talked about in this video released in 1998, and the Switch version that was released in 2019. I've never played the Switch version all the way through, but based on my research and watching others play it, I'd have to say that the Switch version is the best way to experience Link's Awakening. There are so many quality of life updates from the Game Boy version, such as annoying text not appearing on the screen anymore, or the outdated nature of screen transitions being totally removed, which make it hard not to recommend the Switch version over the Game Boy versions. I'd have to say that one thing I prefer in the Game Boy versions over the Switch version is Link's walking animation. In all 3 versions you are restricted to 8 directions of movement, but for the Game Boy, you're able to slide around and even moonwalk, which is definitely funny to see. In the Switch version, there is no animation between the 8 directions of movement, so you snap between directions awkwardly. I think it would have been nicer if Link was given 360 degrees of movement in the remake for the Switch, similar to A Link Between Worlds, or at the very least, adding a couple of frames of animation between directions, so that the transitions don't look as awkward. Either way, whichever of the 3 versions of Link's Awakening that you choose to play, I'm sure a fun time would be guaranteed regardless. So that's it for the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and let me know in the comments what you think of Link's Awakening or what you think of this video. I've already posted videos covering my experience for Zelda 1, Zelda 2, and A Link to the Past on this channel, so check those out if you haven't already. I'm planning on making videos like these for every single Zelda game, so make sure to subscribe to not miss out on your favorite Zelda games. So with that, I'll see you in the next one.